The story that I'm about to tell you is speculation, but it's speculation based upon facts that we know from the New Testament. And it's based around two verses from the Gospel of St. Mark in chapter 14, verses 51 to 52. When they come to arrest Jesus, Mark writes, "A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." These words only appear in Mark's Gospel, and over the years, scholars have puzzled over that fact. Many have come to the conclusion that the reason that Mark includes them is because the young man referred to was Mark himself, and it is his signature within the Gospel. I was there. Since we know that Mark's family lived in Jerusalem, and at a later date his mother's house became a centre for the early church, this seems extremely likely. Let me take you therefore to Alexandria about the year AD 80, where its bishop, the by now aged John Mark, is addressing a meeting of the church. "I know that some of you have read the new Gospels by Matthew and Luke and have asked me whether I mind that they freely borrowed from my Gospel. Of course not. Someone did also point out that one little incident is mentioned in my Gospel that the other two omit. Why is that? Well, it's because that person who ran away naked in the garden is standing here before you. It was me. Let me tell you the story of that day. Most of you will know that I grew up in Jerusalem. Some of you will have visited our old house in Jerusalem because for years it was a headquarters of the church. It was here that we met to pray when Peter was in prison, for instance, and sent up prayer 24/7 for his release. And of course, we didn't believe it when he was released. Sadly, of course, it was all destroyed when the Romans took Jerusalem, and it's still only a ruin today. It all began early that morning when my father asked for a water jar. I was surprised. My father never fetched the water. He called it women's work. You never saw a man carrying a water jar in Jerusalem any more than you do in Alexandria. And I made a comment which led to me getting a clip behind my ear. Certainly my dad made sure there wasn't much water in it. He came back an hour later with Peter and John, who proceeded to get the upstairs room, the upper room in our house, ready for a Passover meal. I only realized later that Dad carrying a water jar had been a secret sign agreed with Jesus in advance, so that only the men he sent would know where the Last Supper would be beforehand. They arrived in early evening, 13 of them, Jesus and the 12 disciples, excited, expectant. It was, after all, the Passover. I remember noticing that one or two of them were carrying a sword. I'd never seen one of Jesus' followers with a sword before. My father saw me skulking in the corner and sent me upstairs to wash their feet. You're the youngest round here. But when I got there, admittedly as late as I could, I found Jesus washing the disciples' feet. There seemed something deeply wrong here, and Peter clearly felt it too. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. Later, I was just about to take another jug of wine upstairs when Judas came hurrying down the stairs. He almost knocked me over as he hurried out into the night. I'd been sent to bed by the time they left the house, but just as Jesus and the 11 disciples left, they seemed excited, as if something they didn't know what was about to happen. And on the spur of the moment, I grabbed a cloak from the peg by the door and crept out into the dark after them. It was my father's best one, but I'd have it back for him before he noticed it was missing. It was an unusually warm spring night, and I'd been sleeping with nothing on, so the cloak was quite sufficient both for my modesty and for warmth. But where were they going? They set out across the city, walking through the edges of the temple precincts and onwards through the city gates and down into the Kidron ravine, back up the Mount of Olives. I'd just decided they were going back to Bethany like they had every other night that week. Lots of the pilgrims stayed in Bethany for the Passover because the city limits were extended to take in the village just for that purpose. And so I was just about to turn back and go home when they turned off into an olive grove, the Garden of Gethsemane. I crept in and hid among the trees. I think John saw me, but he didn't say anything. There I saw Jesus go off to one side with Peter, James, and John, and he began to pray like I'd never seen anyone pray before or since. Beads of sweat rolled off him. Or was it blood seeping out? I couldn't tell. I shivered as I pulled the cloak closer around my shoulders. I crept closer and heard the agony. One by one, the disciples drooped, then fell asleep. They'd eaten so much, drunk so much, and the excitement of the day that had passed was getting to them. 3 times Jesus woke them. The 3rd time he said, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." I followed his eyes. To my horror, I saw a great crowd of armed men surrounding the garden, interspersed with priests and scribes. There were hundreds of them, 500 soldiers at least, with Judas at the head. It was quite clear why they'd come. At first there was a hesitation. Jesus went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. But when Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus answered. "If you're looking for me, then let these men go." Yet still they hesitated. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. The disciples ran. They ran like rabbits with a fox behind them. I was frozen with horror. Then one of the priests grabbed me. "Here's another one!" But I wriggled out of the cloak and ran off after the others back up the Mount of Olives. I fell once, but one of the other disciples grabbed me under the shoulder and hauled me to my feet while he was still running. When we got to the top, we realized that we weren't being followed, and James stopped us. It quickly became clear Peter and John weren't with us. We assumed that they'd both been arrested, not knowing that they'd been missed in the crowd, and had followed the arresting party up to the high priest's house. James said we should carry on to Bethany. Most of their luggage was there anyway, and they felt they needed to warn Mary, Martha, and Lazarus and tell them what had happened. Besides, as James pointed out, his mother and the other women were still in Jerusalem, so the remaining disciples couldn't leave without trying to get them out first. On Friday, I crept back into Jerusalem, and the awfulness of what had happened began to dawn. Fortunately, that day of blackness was transformed by the glory of the Resurrection Sunday. And so, my father, first through shock and then through joy, never did punish me for losing his best cloak.